On the 12th of September, 1982, just outside Anchorage, Alaska, state troopers approached a remote site near a river. Buried in the ground was the body of a young woman. She'd been shot with a hunting rifle.
It became apparent that the killer was transporting these victims alive to these locations and then killing them there.
Police were soon tracking one of North America's most notorious serial killers, a man who stalked his victims in strip clubs and along busy city center streets.
It was a part of society that was easily victimized, and he knew it, and he knew how to go after it.
It obviously gave him a tremendous power rush, and he was addicted by it.
He's the boogeyman. He's somebody who just turns around, and all of a sudden you're faced with evil.
Along with police, there were those who chronicled the investigation in minute detail, on film, on paper, and on tape. Through their lenses, they captured the story of the human hunter. The state of Alaska is sometimes called the last frontier, a reference to its vast expanses of wilderness. It's considered one of the best places in the world to hunt for large game. But in the early 1980s, a different kind of prey suddenly came under attack. Anchorage, the gateway to the rest of the state. In 1980, the city was growing rapidly, filling up with newcomers and anonymous faces. The center of the city soon developed a rowdy night scene, one that was difficult for local police to monitor.
It was, at the time, just a string of bars and nightclubs featuring topless dancers, all kinds of porno shops. When all of these people began to flood in to Anchorage, it expanded. You could go down at any time of the day or night, and the streets were crowded.
We had a big profusion of prostitution during that time. It was hard with some of it to keep tabs, to know who was where and what was going on.
Talent agencies from outside used to cycle women through. Basically, prostitutes would come up here, or topless dancers, work a couple of months, and then be sent to Seattle, Portland, Honolulu.
On the 17th of November 1981, 23-year-old Sherry Morrow was dropped off by her boyfriend at a city center bar, where she worked as a waitress and dancer. The following day, she seemed to have vanished into thin air. Her boyfriend filed a missing persons report, but given the fact that dancers frequently left town at short notice, police weren't overly concerned.
It's a transient lifestyle that they had, and if you've got dancers or prostitutes that are here today, gone tomorrow, I mean, that's a normal course of event for a lot of them.
Sherry's file was placed alongside those of at least 4 other dancers who had been reported missing in the previous year.
Their view of it, which wasn't completely unfounded, was these women come and go, they've got no roots here, they're not missing, they just moved on.
The following May, a young woman named Sue Luna arrived in the city to begin a 6-week dancing contract and moved into a building where several other women who worked the downtown scene lived. Sue was from Seattle, but had relatives in Alaska. her sister Bobby, and Bobby's husband David.
My wife was quite a bit older than her, and they was pretty close together. She was a pretty nice girl. She really liked everything.
Although Bobby was happy to see her sister, she worried about her working in a strip club. She'd heard stories of dancers going missing and tried to convince Sue to carry a weapon for self-defense.
She told Sue, said, "You better take this gun." She had a little .25 automatic. Said, "Take this, carry it with you." But Sue wouldn't do it.
Reassuring her sister that there was nothing to worry about, Sue returned to Anchorage, promising to visit again on her next day off. When that day arrived, however, Sue didn't show up.
Susie's supposed to come out and see her on Wednesday, and she didn't come. She didn't make it. And Bobby tried to call her, and she couldn't get a hold of her.
Bobby decided to go in person to Sue's apartment building, only to learn that her younger sister hadn't been seen for at least 3 days.
She thought something bad happened to her. She didn't really know, though. She worried a tremendous amount.
On the 12th of September, 1982, 25 miles north of Anchorage, along a remote stretch of river, off-duty Anchorage police officer John Daly and a colleague were hunting for wild game.
We had gone moose hunting, and it was just getting too windy and rough, so we decided to pull off and camp in a set of trees near there. So we set up a small camp and then decided to check around the area, see if there's any moose in that area.
Not far from their camp, along the river's shoreline, they noticed a boot sticking out of the sand. Looking closer, they saw a trouser leg. Only then did they realize what they'd stumbled across.
It was a pair of blue jeans and just the knee you could see there. And looking at it and feeling it, you could tell that there was bone underneath.
The men quickly made their way to a phone. Because the location was outside Anchorage city limits, the Alaska State Troopers were called in. With foul play suspected, a murder investigator and small backup team were dispatched.
In this particular case, it was in a remote area only accessible by riverboat, airplane, or a four-wheel drive vehicle. And so they would have driven out there with their equipment and their gear and their cameras. They would have cordoned off the area, and then very carefully they photographed the crime scene as it was found, not disturbing anything. They then very carefully removed the body from the grave like doing an archaeological dig.
The decomposing body belonged to a young woman. She'd been blindfolded with bandages, confirming suspicions of foul play. After the body had been exhumed, the rest of the grave was combed for clues.
They very carefully removed the dirt and screened it, looking for anything that might relate either to the victim or the possible suspect.
They found the spent shell casing of a .223 caliber bullet. Back in the crime lab, a forensic pathologist discovered shell fragments from the bullet inside the victim's chest, and dental records identified the body. It was Sherry Morrow, the 23-year-old dancer reported missing by her boyfriend the previous autumn. As police continued to investigate, no hard evidence connected the murder to the cases of the other missing dancers. And Bobby Moorhead remained hopeful that her younger sister Sue was still alive.
She checked on everything, and she checked on every lead and everything, and checked with the law and all that.
Others on the street, however, were less optimistic. With one woman dead and at least 5 others missing, fear was taking hold of downtown Anchorage.
the well-known prostitutes back then would make mention that, you know, something wasn't right.
We got wind that at least the women working in the strip joints in town believed that something was wrong, that there was someone, or maybe more than someone, out there preying on them.
That someone would soon strike again. In October 1982, police in Alaska were investigating the murder of dancer Sherry Morrow, found blindfolded in a shallow grave just outside Anchorage. From her boyfriend, police learnt that Sherry had spoken about an anonymous client who'd approached her at work. The man had flashed a large sum of money and asked her to pose for nude photographs.
Her boyfriend reported that she had a date with an unknown individual for a photo shoot. She went to the photo shoot, but did not return.
Investigators decided to re-examine the files of the other dancers reported missing in the past 2 years. When they looked at the case of Sue Luna, they noticed a disturbing similarity. Sue also had plans to attend a photo shoot with an unknown man on the day she disappeared. Treating the mystery photographer as a possible prime suspect, a state trooper and city police officer infiltrated the downtown scene.
We then started spending a lot of time in the bars at night trying to identify people that were wanting to do unusual things that sort of stood out. As a result of that, we came up with a list of maybe 15 possible suspects reported to us through many of the girls that were working in the nightclubs and the bars.
Many of the men on the list were labeled as bad dates by several women, clients with bizarre sexual fetishes or violent tendencies. Police conducted background checks on each name. Criminal records were scrutinized carefully, particularly those that involved firearms or assault. A few men on the list had had direct contact with Sherry Morrow before she went missing, and they were interviewed at length. But while they admitted to frequenting the downtown scene, detectives could find nothing to connect any of the men with murder. With each passing week, new incidents surfaced and the list of suspicious men grew. The case finally got the break it needed in the early morning of the 13th of June 1983, when screams were heard on a street in downtown Anchorage.
A 17-year-old girl who turned out to be a prostitute from, I believe, Oregon, ran down Fifth Avenue in handcuffs.
And she runs down Fifth Avenue screaming, "He's going to kill me, he's going to kill me."
The woman managed to flag down a passing truck.
The man lets her into his vehicle, and then she tells him to drive down the road a couple of blocks to a motel. And because of the ruckus that was created by her screaming and running down the road and going to the motel, the police were called.
A local officer named Greg Baker interviewed the shaken woman. Once she'd calmed down, she told him what had happened. The previous evening, she'd been working a downtown street corner when a man approached her in his car.
He wanted to have sex with her for money. She agreed and climbed into the car. And while she was in the front seat, he then pulled out a pair of handcuffs and put one handcuff on her wrist and immediately pulled out a gun and put it in her face, and then kidnapped her at gunpoint and then drove her to his house.
She told police that he had chained her to a post in the basement and kept her there for several days, raping her periodically and keeping her chained up while he slept.
She described the interior of the house, the garage, the basement, and the fact that in the basement there were large animal trophies mounted on the wall. After a couple hours of sleep, he then gets up and then removes the chains from around her neck, puts her back in the car, and then drives her to Merrill Field, where he has his airplane located.
Somehow, while he had to get out of the plane and leave her in order to get the plane started, she ran for her life.
Later that morning, local police followed up the young woman's story. Her directions led them to the door of a well-known local business owner named Robert Hansen, who owned a popular bakery downtown. Hansen was a mild-mannered family man who spoke with a slight stutter.
He had a middle-class home in a middle-class neighborhood. He was married. He had 2 young children. His wife attended church, was very active in the church.
Like many Alaskans, Hansen was also an avid outdoorsman.
He was known in some of the hunting circles. He was a prolific hunter. And some of the trophies that he got were fairly amazing. He liked to sheep hunt quite a bit.
When questioned about the young woman's allegations, Hansen said he knew nothing.
Hansen denied having contact with the woman.
Hansen said, no, it wasn't me. Couldn't have been me.
And in fact had said that he was with 2 other gentlemen that night, 2 friends of his. And when the police interviewed both of his alibi witnesses, both of them told the police that Hansen was with them and there's no way that he could have been with this prostitute.
So from their point of view, you've got a 17-year-old hooker accusing this man who owns a local business, who's active in a local church, who lives in a respectable neighborhood, and who has a friend with similar credentials backing him up.
Although no charges were laid against him, Robert Hansen's name was passed on to the task force investigating the murder of Sherry Morrow, as well as the cases involving the other missing dancers. Hansen joined a list of suspicious men now numbering close to 24. At the same time, another disturbing list continued to grow. By the summer of 1983, 3 more women had been reported missing. As many as 10 were now unaccounted for. On the 2nd of September 1983, along the same stretch of river where Sherry Morrow had been found, hunters noticed what appeared to be pieces of bone sticking out of the sand. A closer look revealed a decomposing human body. Murder investigator Glenn Flothy made his way to the remote location, even more difficult to reach than the gravesite a year earlier. At the grave, clothing suggested they were again dealing with the body of a young woman.
We very carefully examined the site as an archaeologist would, a layer at a time, taking pictures as we go along, very carefully removing the dirt, taking a picture, remove more dirt, take a picture, and then taking the soil from the grave site and then screening that through wire mesh screens and very carefully sifting that, looking for any evidence.
Police found a .223 shell casing, identical to the one discovered in Sherry Morrow's grave, confirming the likelihood of a single suspect. More details surfaced in the mortuary.
I saw her first at one of the mortuaries here, and she had a bullet hole in her sternum. So the single bullet hole went up through her sternum, directed upward, and came out through her shoulder blade. She would have died very quickly, within a heartbeat or 2.
Using dental records, the woman was identified as 30-year-old Paula Goulding, a dancer reported missing in April that year.
Now we had 2 victims found in shallow graves, partially clothed, that had been transported to that location by a suspect.
State troopers organized a massive search in the area where the bodies had been found, fearing that other dancers might have met a similar fate. Bobby Moorhead and her husband David also joined in the search. Bobby's mood now was not so positive, and she wondered whether her missing sister Sue was still alive.
Back then we had some horses, and we rode up and down that river searching. This is big country up here. There's a lot of searching to be done up here. We always had hopes, but then when we seen all these bodies start showing up and hopes start getting away from you, she got pretty depressed, very depressed.
Now, amongst the dancers themselves and their friends, and those working in the clubs, there was a heightened sense of concern. They sort of implemented a buddy system, you know. They don't go anywhere unless you know where you're going and who you're with. They'll let us know what time you're coming back.
If you're a prostitute, your job is to go to strangers, go to some place that nobody can see you doing the act, and that makes for a very available victim.
The final number of victims would surprise even the most hardened of investigators. In 1983, a serial killer was loose in downtown Anchorage, Alaska. 2 nightclub dancers had been murdered, and many others were unaccounted for. Among them was a young woman named Sue Luna, first reported missing by her sister Bobby. Police were convinced their suspect appeared harmless at first glance, gaining the women's trust before luring them to their deaths. While state troopers headed the investigation into the murders, a local Anchorage police officer followed up on his own hunch. It involved mild-mannered Robert Hansen, the stuttering bakery owner accused of raping a prostitute that same year. Although Hansen had an alibi and the case was quickly closed, Officer Greg Baker felt it deserved closer investigation.
He went through the paper files of the department looking for old mentions of Hansen. Remember, this is before computers, and if you didn't actually get charged with a crime, creating a court record, you know, the police report of what happened went into some file, into some drawer. And what Baker did was go through reams and reams of paper looking for stuff, and he came up with at least 3 incidents in which prostitutes had accused Hansen of, you know, beating them up or trying to kidnap them that were not prosecuted.
Greg Baker showed his findings to the Joint Task Force investigating the murders. Buried in old files, a clear pattern of violence against women going back years emerged. The more they dug, the more they found. In 1971, reports showed Hansen kidnapped and raped a prostitute, a crime for which he was never charged. Although he was convicted of assault that same year, he did relatively little prison time.
Here we have a man living in the community that we ourselves did not know about, and yet other officers had contacted him on previous occasions years before. He actually was quite well known by the police, but for some reason was allowed to slip through the cracks of the criminal justice system.
Now, looking at their 2 murder investigations, detectives made a striking connection. Of all the men on their list, only Robert Hansen owned the type of vehicle that fitted the circumstances.
They had a list of suspects. Only one of them was a pilot with a plane. That was Robert Hansen. And they focused on him.
We now had a bona fide suspect.
Police tracked down the 17-year-old woman who had recently accused Hansen of kidnapping and rape. If their hunch was correct, she narrowly escaped with her life. The young woman was immediately placed under protective surveillance.
We assigned 2 of the vice cops to keep an eye on her, make contact with her every night, to keep a watch on things and make sure that no harm would become to her. She was our key witness right now.
At the same time, Robert Hansen was placed under constant watch. Police had yet to find hard evidence tying him to the murders, but they feared he would strike again.
We became very concerned that our suspect may in fact kidnap another victim while we're conducting the investigation and perhaps do it right under our nose. We used undercover narcotics officers, undercover vehicles, and we followed Hansen 24 hours a day. We sort of came to the conclusion that this man never slept. He would work for several hours, and then he'd take a break, and then we'd be following him around the streets of Anchorage, just driving around the bars and the streets where the prostitutes hung out.
But as the days passed, Hansen did nothing incriminating, and nothing new surfaced to tie him to the murdered dancers. Looking for a way to break the case, Sergeant Glenn Flothy decided on a fresh approach. He'd recently read about a new technique called criminal profiling. An FBI team had been making headlines for its insight into serial killers. Flothy decided to call the Bureau directly and get their opinion of suspect Robert Hansen.
The FBI agent was very helpful, and when I started to tell the agent about the suspect, he said, no, don't tell me about the suspect. You tell me about the victims, and I'll tell you about the suspect.
Flothy described the grave sites as well as the cases involving the missing dancers. The agent then replied with the likely attributes of the man behind the crimes.
He told me that the suspect was probably a white male adult, late 30s, early 40s, that he was probably a respected member of the community, maybe a business owner, might be an avid hunter, and that the suspect may even stutter. And I was just taken back because that was very similar to the background of Robert Hansen himself, and he stuttered. Pretty amazing.
The agent also suggested that the best evidence against Hansen would probably be found inside his own home, as serial killers like to keep mementos of their crimes. Based on the profile, the recent rape allegations, as well as Hansen's violent criminal past, police obtained a comprehensive search warrant for his home and vehicles.
This was the first time ever in any criminal case in the United States that the information used in criminal profiling by the FBI had been used in an affidavit for a search warrant. So we were breaking new ground at that point.
On the evening of the 26th of October 1983, the task force assembled for a lengthy briefing.
We brought in investigators from other detachment areas, as we were going to need a number of personnel to conduct a number of searches simultaneously.
Following advice from the FBI, an interview room was set up with Robert Hansen in mind, covered in pictures and headlines related to the murders and missing dancers. Should physical evidence prove scarce, prying a confession from Hansen before he contacted his lawyer would be the only hope of solving the case.
We sent investigators over to his house to surveil his house to let us know when he was leaving his home to go to his bakery. We sent another team of investigators out to Merrill Field to sit on his airplane to make sure that he didn't drive to the airport and take off in his plane.
A third team staked out Robert Hansen's downtown bakery. The entire investigation rested on securing hard evidence from his property or extracting a full confession. By 7 a.m., the operation was in full swing.
Hansen showed up to work. The two investigators very casually approached him, told him that there was something the troopers wanted to talk to him about, being very non-specific, very non-threatening. and asking if he'd be willing to come to the office. He said sure. He got in the car with the investigators, and they took him to Trooper headquarters.
With Hansen in transit, his 2 vehicles, as well as his aeroplane, were impounded. A separate team of investigators then arrived at his home. After escorting his wife and 2 children to a neighbor's house, they moved inside.
Once we knew that the residence is secure, the next thing we do is photograph every inch of the house. You photograph everything on the walls, everything on the floors. So we're very careful to photograph everything as it was in place, as we found it.
On the other side of the city, Robert Hansen arrived at police headquarters, where he was taken to the interview room specifically designed to rattle a guilty conscience.
Hansen was obviously very nervous. We let him sit in a room for probably 10 minutes or so, just to kind of absorb his surroundings, to look at the maps and see the locations of where the bodies have been found. There was pictures of the victim spread out on a desk. Pictures like ID photos. So right away he, I think, knew where we were headed. He just wasn't quite sure how we were going to go about it.
Investigators began by asking Hansen about his younger years, before bringing up the murders.
It's sort of a dramatic thing going on. They're talking to him and keeping in touch with the people who are searching the house. They don't want to let him go. They're hoping they'll find something in the house.
After capturing the main floor on film, investigators entered Hansen's basement. As expected, it was exactly as detailed by the 17-year-old woman who'd said she was held captive there and raped. Massive animal heads and numerous hunting trophies loomed on every wall.
She could describe the black bear hide on the floor, the mounts on the walls, right down to where the bolts were screwed in, where the chains were attached to. Everything that she had detailed in her statement we found.
With more evidence now in hand to charge Hansen with kidnapping and rape, investigators began searching the entire home for clues related to the murders. Meanwhile, in the interview room, Robert Hansen admitted to using prostitutes in the past, but denied ever harming them.
He, however, did make admissions to flying his airplane in the area where the bodies were found, landing in the areas where the bodies were found. And he said he did a lot of practicing shooting wolves from his airplane over that area.
The hours passed.
It became apparent to us that he wasn't going to admit it, and it became apparent to him that we weren't going to give up. And so at that point, he asked for an attorney, and the interview ended.
Although Hansen was held in custody, police were only able to charge him with the rape and kidnapping of the 17-year-old woman. That same day, investigators confronted the 2 men who'd originally provided Hansen with an alibi for that crime.
The 2 alibi witnesses, both of them broke immediately once they found out that we were doing a multi-victim investigation.
The men admitted that Hansen hadn't been with them on the evening in question, as they'd originally stated. At the time, they'd simply agreed to lie for their friend, believing his claims of innocence. Police now knew they had a strong case for kidnapping and rape, but at Hansen's home, they had yet to find anything to connect him to the murders or the numerous missing women.
It was apparent that things weren't going as well as we had hoped for. We had been at this now for 3 months, pretty hard, pretty steady. We were running 24-hour surveillance on him, working 7 days a week, up late nights. We were all very, very tired at that point, and very disappointed.
Eventually, the hard work and long hours paid off.
After searching the entire house, one of the investigators then went into the residence's attic. And in the far back corner, under the insulation, we found a stash of weapons.
Among the weapons was a .223 rifle, the kind used to kill Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding. Beneath another section of insulation, they found a plastic bag.
We opened the bag, and in that bag was jewelry, identification cards, and business cards belonging to numerous victims, and some victims we had not yet were even aware had disappeared.
They found a unique necklace that belonged to one of the victims. They got what they needed.
We were elated, and we were absolutely confident that we had our man and we had our case.
While police awaited ballistic test results before charging Hansen with the murders, the city of Anchorage was only told that a well-known bakery owner had been charged with rape. The headlines to come, however, would stun everyone, especially once police had deciphered the meaning behind 21 X's penciled in on aerial flight maps found on Hansen's property, revealing him to be one of North America's most predatory serial killers. In November 1983, Robert Hansen, a bakery owner from Anchorage, Alaska, was charged with the rape and kidnapping of a 17-year-old woman. A rifle found in his home connected him to the murders of at least 2 nightclub dancers. Police held off laying the additional charges until they knew the full scope of Hansen's crimes. While Hansen sat behind bars, detectives tried to work out not if, but rather how many women he had kidnapped and murdered. Their attention was soon drawn to flight maps found on Hansen's property.
On those flight maps, interestingly, were little X's scattered around that say within a 100-mile air radius of Anchorage.
The 21 small crosses seemed to suggest places Hansen had flown to before.
We knew he was an avid hunter. We suspected at that time that those marks were places where he had bagged wild game.
But detectives noticed that 2 of the marks were in places that they had also been to, the graves of Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding.
Those weren't marks of locations where he had hunted previously. These were marks of locations where he had killed and left his victims. And these maps had 21 marks on them. We were absolutely shocked. We didn't expect that. We were thinking maybe a half a dozen victims. We were not thinking 21 victims.
As he awaited trial on kidnapping and rape charges, investigators finally revealed to Hansen and his lawyer the evidence they had connecting him to the murders of Sherry Morrow, Paula Goulding, and at least 2 other women.
Hansen didn't know at that time that we had the maps and that we knew what the maps meant.
Knowing that a jury would find him guilty and wanting to avoid the publicity of a lengthy trial, Hansen finally agreed to give police what they wanted: a full confession.
Initially, Hansen admitted to 3 or 4 of the murders, the ones that we knew about. And at that point, the DA said, "We have these maps." Showed him a copy of the maps and said, "For every location on this map, we're going to fly out there, we're going to find the victim, we're going to come back, and we're going to charge you with that. We're going to go out and we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it again. So you make up your mind now. You're either going to tell us or we'll be back." We owed it to the families and the victims.
Finally, face to face with all of his crimes, Robert Hansen's defenses fell apart. Over the course of the next few days, he confessed to a total of 17 murders and 30 rapes, most involving dancers and prostitutes from downtown Anchorage. In many of the cases, he approached women in his mild-mannered way with an offer to make some easy money. Once away from the public eye, he violently took control, raping them repeatedly and keeping them captive, sometimes at remote hunting cabins for several days at a time. Although Hansen didn't admit it, police felt sure he released and hunted many of his victims to their deaths.
He'd take the victims like live out to the flats, release them, and hunt them. You know, he went from hunting animals to people.
On the 27th of February 1984, in an Anchorage courtroom, the public finally heard for the first time the full extent of Robert Hansen's crimes. News of the confession hit Anchorage like a bombshell. A seemingly innocent member of the local community was in fact one of North America's worst serial killers.
And everybody read it and everybody watched the news. Most serial killers, they're fascinating, and I think the community probably felt that way too. A combination of that and horror, you know. How could anybody do a thing like that?
He was living two separate lives, a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde existence.
It's one of those things of, you know, who is it? Is it your next door neighbor? Turned out it was.
He wasn't a big bad wolf type. He wasn't scary because he wouldn't have been successful if he was scary. If he was scary, these savvy street women would never have gone anywhere with him. He looked like somebody they could handle themselves with. They were wrong.
Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years. The mild-mannered baker, soon nicknamed the Butcher, had finally been brought to justice.
It was a real relief to see him go away.
The day after his confession, police used Hansen to help them pinpoint the locations of each body marked on the map.
This was February, midwinter in Alaska, where it's very cold and very dark and there's lots of snow. Middle of nowhere. I mean, here you had to fly 35 minutes by helicopter just to get there. And then he says, this is the place. So we land and we get out with the snowshoes on. We walk 200 yards back in the woods. He falls to his knees and he's clawing through the snow with his hand, saying, I know she's here, I know she's here. And of course, you can't claw through 4 feet of snow. So we grab him and pull him up and tell him, no, that's okay, we're just going to mark it. He seemed to be proud of the fact that he knew exactly where to go and how to get there. And so this went on, we marked all the grave sites, and then came the long, torturous wait for us till spring when the snow melted to see whether or not he was telling us the truth.
In the spring of 1984, police exhumed many of the victims at the marked locations and returned their bodies to their grieving families.
Of the 21 marks on Hansen's maps, he admitted to murdering 17 victims. Of those 17, I believe we found 11 bodies.
Sue Luna was one of those recovered, providing some closure to her sister Bobby.
That was a big relief. She found peace after she found her body. Until then, she didn't.
It's going to have an everlasting impact on the victims, their families. I mean, their mothers, their fathers, their parents, their siblings, their friends. And this impact, it's a shockwave throughout the entire community.
Robert Hansen remains behind bars. His lengthy sentence makes it impossible for him to ever hunt again.
If there had been a death penalty in Alaska, he'd been the right person for the death penalty.
They got him where he's supposed to be now, I guess. I don't think he'll ever walk free again. Hope not. If he does, he won't walk free long, I'll guarantee you that.
How monsters like that are made are beyond me.